I can't remember if Faulkner said this himself or if someone else said it, but let's say that Faulkner said it. He basically said the best novelists are failed poets, and it seems to be true here. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today is a historic day here at Leaf by Leaf Enterprises. As always, the complaints department here is swamped and backed up by about 3 months worth of letters and tweets and X's and O's and blue skies and whatever. But we're going to get around to addressing one of the chief complaints that have passed through the complaints department for the last 5 years, and that is to get some William Faulkner on the channel at last. Some of you from watching previous videos may be aware that there are some authors that it's very difficult for me to make a video on these authors or works by these authors because they're almost sacred to me, and there's almost something. I don't want to sound too lofty here or too outlandish, but there's something that just holds me back. There's just something sacred or whatever. But Shakespeare, Borges, Faulkner, Proust, Melville. It's like I can't bring myself to bring them onto the channel. Nonetheless, today we're talking about The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, in a collection of essays from the 90s on The Sound and the Fury, edited by Noel Polk, he kicks it off in the introduction with statements that I think are just so perfectly concise that I can't help but kick off the video by quoting directly from them. At the beginning of his introductory paragraph, he says, "The Sound and the Fury is the quintessential American high modernist text." And he caps off the same paragraph with this: "It remains a Matterhorn of seemingly inexhaustible splendor." And that's all I'm going to be reading from the collection of critical texts. Because, listen, when it comes to The Sound and the Fury, there has been so much written about it. There's so much critical work out there, non-critical work out there, that in preparing for this video, I finally just gave up and decided I would just do my own little riffing commentary using my notes from this third read, my first read in something like 15 years. I think 2010 was the last time I saw that I had read it. Just going to go through what I got out of it and just kind of riff, give you a couple of things from what I think is one of the best of the Paris Review interviews, that being their one with William Faulkner. So we'll kick it off with the Paris Review interview. I've got these 4 volumes that the Paris Review put out of their interviews, the Art of Fiction series. But like I said, here's Faulkner's attitude. And another thing that I've really learned, especially from the biography about Faulkner, is he was very much a performer. One moment. Hollywood really sort of accorded with Faulkner in terms of, acting, productions, and there were many Faulkners. And I've actually just this morning, in fact, finished the Graham Robb biography of Victor Hugo, and Hugo was very much the same way. There were so many different Hugos within Hugo, and it's just really interesting, and you can glean the sort of different personas in just this interview alone. But anyway, I'm getting a little long-winded here. Faulkner says, but what is important is Hamlet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, not who wrote them, but that somebody did. The artist is of no importance. Everybody, according to Faulkner, should be too busy with the work to care about the individuality. And indeed, just with The Sound and the Fury alone, this is true. You could stay busy with this text for the rest of your life, honestly, and not even worry about the author behind it. Just be thankful that despite who that author really was, it got written. We have to be thankful. Faulkner says the writer's only responsibility is to his art. He will be completely ruthless if he is a good one, a good artist, a good writer. If a writer has to rob his mother, he will not hesitate. The Ode on a Grecian Urn is worth any number of old ladies, which is really funny. That's just classic Faulkner right there. Just a great thinker, great writer, and also Ode on a Grecian Urn, there by Keats, was one of his favorite poems. Art has no concern with peace and contentment. My own experience has been that the tools I need for my trade are paper, tobacco, food, and a little whiskey. Now, one feels that he is being a little cheeky when he says a little whiskey. It really, his life shows that he required quite a bit of whiskey. About The Sound and the Fury, he says, I wrote it 5 separate times, trying to tell the story, to rid myself of the dream which would continue to anguish me until I did. It's a tragedy of 2 lost women, Caddy and her daughter, Quinton. Dilsey is one of my own favorite characters because she is brave, courageous, generous, gentle, and honest. She's much more brave and honest and generous than me. And some of this is well known, but he says that as far as the origins of The Sound and the Fury, it began with a mental picture. I didn't realize at the time it was symbolical. It was the picture of a muddy seat of a little girl's drawers in a pear tree, where she could see through a window where her grandmother's funeral was taking place and report what was happening to her brothers on the ground below. Then later he says, I had already begun to tell the story through the eyes of the idiot child, since I felt that it would be more effective as told by someone capable only of knowing what happened, but not why. And this, of course, the Sound and the Fury, as is pretty well known, takes its title from Macbeth, and it's talking about, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, and so on. And just from that little bit alone, Faulkner gets a great deal of mileage in The Sound and the Fury. And also his imposing constraints on himself, such as telling the first part through the eyes of the idiot Benji. It's the book I feel tenderest toward. I couldn't leave it alone, and I never could tell it right, though I tried hard and would like to try again, though I'd probably fail again. And there were even plans, there's well-known anecdotes about how when it was first presented, his editor, Sam Wasson, I believe, who was also a friend, he said, take out all these italics, which for Faulkner signaled to the reader lapses in time, either backwards or forward. So either a prolepsis or an analepsis, right? And the editor said, let's put in section breaks. But Faulkner was adamant. This was his idea. He wanted it to be Roman type versus italics. And I think we'll get into some of that a little later. But he even said that he wanted to go so far as to use color coding to give visual cues of the anachronism of the book. And in fact, later on, after he actually became successful, because when The Sound and the Fury first came out, it was like one of those writer's writer type books, artist artist, and didn't do very well. But later, when he got popular, there was a project for a publisher to come out with a version that had the color coding, but it got dropped. It was probably too expensive. Yeah, so he says you can't feel anything for Benji because he doesn't feel anything. And Benji is incapable of good and evil because he had no knowledge of good and evil. And, you know, I have to, yeah, Faulkner says you can't feel anything for Benji. I do feel for Benji, but the more I think about it, the more I think that feeling comes from the way that he's treated by Caddy, and we'll get into that later. Faulkner says a writer needs three things: experience, observation, and imagination, any two of which, at times any one of which, can supply the lack in the others. The interviewer, this is great. This is classic Faulkner, and I totally agree with him, especially with The Sound and the Fury. But the interviewer in the Paris Review, Stein, I believe, wasn't it? Does it have her name? Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, Jean Stein. Some people say they can't understand your writing, even after they have read it 2 or 3 times. What approach would you suggest for them? And Faulkner just simply says, read it 4 times. But it is true, because anybody who could read this and get all of it, get everything that's going on the first, second, even the third read. Like I said, I've now read it 3 times, and there are still things I'm a little muddy on. It's impossible. And anybody who could do that is, some kind of idiot savant of literary reading. But there's just so much packed into this, and it is accretive and evocative in such a way to where things bubble up and you think you kind of understand what might be getting hinted here, but you have to keep reading to have different evocations confirmed or denied, some of which are never conclusively affirmed or denied. But you need the full context of the book before you go in and you can start really mining the fine details. But nonetheless, it's also got this quality where every time you read it, you're amazed by it. And that was one thing I thought about when I was reading it this time and thinking about things to say. Faulkner, sometimes I see Faulkner get lumped into 2 different camps. And there's the one camp where he gets lumped into contemporary American writers. What I mean is like those writers, those really famous male writers of the 20th century in American literature. And so basically Hemingway and Steinbeck and that ilk. And I feel like that's pretty misrepresentative, because whereas Faulkner can do all the things that they can do, it doesn't go the other way. He does things that they can't do. But what'll happen is people who haven't read Faulkner, or they've read something like an early work, just, like Soldier's Pay or Sanctuary, maybe Light in August, something like that. But largely those who haven't read Faulkner and have him associated with the Steinbeck and Hemingway and so on, I think tend to sort of bracket him off and just say, yeah, I'll get to that kind of fiction when I get to it. I'm having too much fun with all this really cool and flashy and artistic fiction. Then he also gets lumped in fairly and correctly, I would say, with the high modernists, with Joyce, with Proust, with Woolf, Dostoevsky. And this gets it more, especially maybe an intersection of Joyce and Dostoevsky. When you go and you read The Sound and the Fury, if you're not familiar with Faulkner, I honestly think you would be very, very surprised at what he was doing in this book. Formally, I mean, aesthetically, really, really pushing him way outside the bounds of the Hemingways and the Steinbecks. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case you're the type of person who has that categorization. He says, I don't want money badly enough to work for it. In my opinion, it's a shame that there is so much work in the world. One of the saddest things is that the only thing a man can do for 8 hours a day, day after day, is work. Hear, hear, in praise of leisure time. He says, the books I read are the ones I knew and loved when I was a young man, and to which I return as you do to old friends. And he lists the Old Testament, Dickens, Conrad, Cervantes, Don Quixote, and famously, Faulkner said that he read Don Quixote every year, as some do the Bible. Flaubert, Balzac, he created an intact world of his own, a bloodstream running through 20 books, Balzac. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Shakespeare. I read Melville occasionally, and of the poets, Marlowe, Campion, Johnson, Herrick, Donne, Keats, and Shelley. And then he says this. When the interviewer asks, what is the function of the critic? Faulkner says the artist is a cut above the critic. For the artist is writing something that will move the critic. The critic is writing something that will move everybody but the artist. And when I reread that in this interview this time around, I mean, it's been so long since I've read this interview, and I'm a totally different person now and with totally different aspirations. The first time I read it, I was mainly mining it for writing advice because I wanted to be a novelist. But this time around, I read that and I thought, you know what? That's a challenge to me. I don't want to be the critic who moves everybody but the artist. I want to even move the artist. And so I kind of took that as a personal mantra. Obviously, I can't move Faulkner, but you get the drift. He says, the aim of every artist is to arrest motion, which is life, by artificial means and hold it fixed so that 100 years later, when a stranger looks at it, it moves again, since it is life. And I think he definitely fulfilled that in The Sound and the Fury. Let's see. Yeah. Blah, 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 blah. What happened to you? The interviewer says, what happened to you between Soldier's Pay and Sartoris? That is, what caused you to begin the Yoknapatawpha saga? And he says, I discovered that my own little postage stamp of native soil was worth writing about and that I would never live long enough to exhaust it. Time is a fluid condition which has no existence except in the momentary avatars of individual people. There is no such thing as was, only is. And so, in other words, he saw something very, very rich in the culture, the people around him. And these Yoknapatawpha books are written in such a way to where time is always present. And so, in other words, he had contrived a way to make them always alive, to make them inexhaustible. as we would say now, to transcend the mere period piece. All right. Well, let's jump in here. Let's jump into The Sound and the Fury. All right. So we've got a book in 4 sections. It starts with April 7th, 1928, and is told through Benji. Then we go backwards to June 2nd, 1910, and where it's told through Quinton, Benji's brother. And then we leap forward again, but not quite all the way to where we were when we started. In fact, just to the day before, April 6th, 1928, told through the perspective of Jason, another Compson brother. And then we leap over the opening April 7th and go to April 8th, and it's told in the third person. This is a sort of Faulkner narrator. Some people align this with Dilsey, who is the Compson family servant, who basically is the one who raises all the kids, because the father's just a wastrel and dies of alcoholism, and the mother is sort of a hypochondriac and bedridden. And the mother gets a bad rap by the critical apparatus around us. And it can be easy to read this and just see her as this awful mother. But there's actually one essay in the collection that I quoted from earlier that defends Mrs. Compson in a pretty compelling way, if you're interested in that. Now, a couple of things to watch out for. As is probably well known by now, and as I just said, it jumps around, so it's not chronological. It just kind of zigzags, right? And it's told, the first 3 parts are told constrained through a perspective of one of the 3 Compson brothers, Benji, Quinton, Jason. And now it's all centered around their sister, Caddy. She has been referred to as so many things. She's been referred to diametrically opposed from the concrete, full, vibrant centerpiece of the novel to the empty void, right? I tend to side more towards her being very present. I don't tend to side with the fact that since Faulkner chose not to give her her own section and let the reader hear from her directly, that she's basically erased, and only kept alive by hearsay or whatever. I mean, for me, she dominates the novel. She dominates her brothers. She dominates everyone around her. This is her power. She's like Tolstoy's Natasha, right? And so I can't, see her as someone who gets short shrift or whatever. Because she doesn't get a voice, you want to hear from her all the more, right? So instead, we're getting this sort of oral history of her. Now, a couple of things, I guess, that I'll say to watch out for is that the names can kind of get a little bit confusing, maybe, especially on a first read, because there are the same names, and names have changed. It's almost like reading a Latin American novel, right? And everyone's like got these same names down the patrilineal line or whatever. But in this one, just to break it down a little bit, you've got the mother and the father of this Compson family is Jason Compson Sr. or second, right? I think that's how it goes. But in any case, the father's name is Jason Compson. And there's a son, Jason Compson. And the son is who we actually hear from in the third section. The mother's name is Caroline, and she's a Boscombe. And she's very proud of her Boscombe roots. She's not a Compson. And she draws a distinct line between Compson blood and Boscombe blood. and she has an uncle, Mari. Okay. And Benji, the idiot son, I hate to call him that, but I mean, that's what it's referred to. And that's coming from the Hamlet allusion. Okay. I wouldn't call people with a disability an idiot. I hope you realize that. But anyway, Benji is born Mari, named after his uncle, after his mother's brother, but then gets renamed in the novel to Benjamin. And then it gets shortened to Benji because it's from the Bible and therefore more respectable. It also seems to be a way in which they hope that the curse, his curse, they see his idiocy as a curse. Maybe it will be erased or ameliorated in some way by naming him after one of the Jewish tribes in the Bible. Caddy, of course, is the daughter, and she has a daughter whom she names Quinton. So, not to be confused with the Quinton who speaks to us through the second section of the novel and is in fact Caddy's brother. So, the siblings, again, are Caddy, Benji, nay Mari, Quinton, and Jason. The mother and father are Jason Sr. And Caroline. So just a few things there to, watch out for, because you'll see Quinton, you'll see Jason, and you'll see Mari. And they could be each of those could be referring to one of two people. All right, so yeah, this is where... I'll say that I have to be careful. I don't want to give some things away here, or maybe I just won't be careful. I don't know. All right, so let's go through the Benji section. First of all, again, this is Benji, nay Mari. Some notes going into this section. Restricting himself to writing, of course, from within Benji's perspective allows Faulkner to achieve really just this fresh prose style and this unexpected poetry. And one critic, I can't remember who it was, they put it well. They said, we have to remember, too, that this is because Benji can't speak or write for himself. This is really Faulkner's interpretation of Benji's perspective. This is his rendering of Benji's consciousness. And what happens is that it does achieve this unexpected poetry. And it's a reminder that Faulkner did start out as a poet. And his very first publication, The Green Bow, I think it was, something like that, was a volume of poetry. And people said, it's just too maudlin, too weepily romantic. And he was in love with the British romantics and so on. And Swinburne and Keats. And, I can't remember if Faulkner said this himself or if someone else said it, but let's say that Faulkner said it. He basically said, the best novelists are failed poets. And it seems to be true here. Anyway, Benji is nonverbal, so his tale is told, again, in the Shakespeare allusion, in sound and fury, and really moaning and crying. And it's amazing how much detail we can get about the family, the Compson family, in this way. Its ills, its tensions, its habits, the fall from grace. The Compson family was apparently one of the early notable gentry or settlers of Jefferson, Mississippi, and they've just sort of fallen from grace. Each generation has deteriorated more and more. But yeah, the anachronistic structure mirrors Benji's consciousness and presents the family and its dynamics in a roving collage. So let's go ahead and just step through it and just use some of my notes here. So the very first set of italics, I think this is the very first set. Yeah, the very first set of italics we meet signal a flashback, or it could be a prolepsis. It could be a flash forward. And you'll see immediately that in the Roman type, the non-italicized part, it is getting snagged on a nail at the fence that triggers him to remember this other time that he got snagged on a nail. And so some of the fun, once you start to catch on with what Faulkner's doing, and this carries through the Benji and Quinton sections, but once you start to catch on to what at first is very jarring to us, some of the fun begins to be in the revelation of seeing the little objects that connect Benji's otherwise unorganized and fragmented memory or consciousness, right? It's really amazing. The man said, "Caddy, up the hill." The boy got out of the water and went up the hill. "Now, just listen at you," Luster said. "Hush up. What he moaning about now?" So we're in we're in Benji's perspective, but we're getting the exact dialogue of what's going on around him. Because again, this is Faulkner's rendering of what it's like for Benji. So apparently he can process what people are saying. He just can't make certain connections. But the reason that the man, one of the golfers, has just yelled for his caddy, and then we're hearing from Luster, who is clearly someone who's been assigned to mind Benji, is telling immediately after the golfer yells for the caddy, we hear from Luster that he's telling Benji to hush up, just listen at you. And then the golfer's like, what is he moaning about? They can't figure out what his deal is. Well, what we start to catch on and learn is, of course, that caddy to him means his sister caddy, not the golf caddy. Oh, man. Here's some internal monologue in Benji's voice. "I wasn't crying, but I couldn't stop. I wasn't crying, but the ground wasn't still. And then I was crying. The ground kept sloping up and the cows ran up the hill. TP tried to get up. He fell down again and the cows ran down the hill. Quinton held my arm and we went toward the barn. Then the barn wasn't there and we had to wait until it came back. I didn't see it come back. It came behind us and Quinton set me down in the trough where the cows ate. I held on to it. I was going away too, and I held to it. It was going away too, and I held to it. The cows ran down the hill again across the door. I couldn't stop. Quinton and TP came up the hill, fighting TP. Sorry. TP came up the hill, fighting. TP was falling down the hill, and Quinton dragged him up the hill. Quinton hit TP. I couldn't stop. And it takes a while to figure out, when you first read this, you're like, man, this is wild. Like, what is going on here, right? And then little by little, you piece together the clues that TP and Benji have gotten drunk together. And we realize that we're getting Benji's rendering, or his interpretation of the experience of being drunk, because he doesn't know that he's drunk. And then later we learn that this is actually him remembering something that happened at Caddy's wedding. But again, that's just where some of the surprise, the surprising jolt of the prose comes from. is because Faulkner's not just, spoon feeding us what's going on. We have to piece it together for ourselves. But the pieces are there. They really are. All right. A little later into Benji's section, Roscus says, "Tain't no luck on this place." But then Roscus says, "Don't need no trance. Ain't the sign of it laying right there on that bed? Ain't the sign of it been here for folks to see 15 years now?" And he's referring to Benji. When we open up in the present on April 7th, 1928, Benji, we will learn all this. Benji is 33 years old. I think Luster says something about him being 33-year-old. And of course, now when he says folks to see 15 years now we're learning from Roscus that this current analepsis is happening, 18 years prior, when Benji's 15. But taken from this perspective, Roscus's perspective of Benji is that he's a sign of a curse on the family. And this makes me think of Calvinism and the Calvinist roots in America, where Calvin really drove home the concept of predestination, right? And that everybody is either everybody's already predestined. There's nothing you can do about it to go to either heaven or hell, but that you can figure out whether you're predestined or not, or where you're predestined for or not, through signs. And so this had everyone looking at everything as a sign of whether they're cursed or blessed. And in this case, Benji becomes the Calvinist sign of being the Compson family being predestined for hell. At another point, we're inside now Benji's head again. He says, "Caddy put her arms around me and her shining veil, and I couldn't smell trees anymore, and I began to cry." And we start to learn that he senses through his smell the change in her life from the little girl playing outside to now a grown married woman. And what we learn has happened is that she's put on perfume. And this has masked her natural smell that Benji's used to. So there, that this is the kind of system of symbols that Faulkner is brilliantly working with here. It's not just the mere fact that Benji's upset because he sees Caddy, but he doesn't smell Caddy. It's the symbolism of Caddy growing up and no longer being a little girl. And then finally, like I said, this is where we get a flashback between Caddy and Dilsey, and we learn that Caddy has taken it upon herself to change Maury's name, Benji. Maury. "His name's Benji now," Caddy said. "How come it is," Dilsey said, "he ain't wore out the name he was born with yet, is he?" "Benjamin came out of the Bible," Caddy said. "It's a better name for him than Maury was." "How come it is?" Dilsey said. "Mother says it is," Caddy said. "Huh," Dilsey said. "Name ain't going to help him. Hurt him neither. Folks don't have no luck changing names. My name been Dilsey since 'fore I could remember, and it be Dilsey when they's long forgot me." So, a couple of things here. One, through this, at least for me, I love that sort of grounded, strong, confident folk wisdom or whatever that Dilsey sets forth. And we have to remember that Faulkner, whose family had servants, and Faulkner, who was very comfortable around black people. We're not going to go all into the racial stuff in this video because it's way beyond one video or what I could do. But he was very well acquainted with the we'll call it folk wisdom, the community wisdom, the shared heritage and conventional wisdom of Black people. And Dilsey is sort of that mouthpiece. And you've got to love it because it cuts through, especially in this occasion, it cuts through that sort of Calvinist twaddle. The other thing that's going on here is that, like I said earlier, this appears to be, especially with Caddy's mother's approval, that is Caroline's approval, to change his name, it sets him apart from Uncle Mari, for one thing, and I'll leave that there. But it also does signal them trying to reverse the curse. So that's all I've got for you for the Benji section. Now we'll move into the Quinton section, which is my favorite. I think this is a masterpiece of American literature, this Quinton section. Couple of notes here going into it. Quinton's father has passed down an obsession with death and time, symbolized in the watch and the bells that are constantly ringing and... What? Oh, and him treading his shadow. I really noticed that this time. Him treading his own shadow at different lengths, and it describes different parts of his own body that he's treading in terms of on the shadow. Well, this represents, it's like a sundial. It represents, again, time of day. It's just brilliant. We get more of the story. It begins to take form from these splinters of memory. And it gets weird. All right. It gets weird and wild and very questionable in the Quinton section. I mean, the Quinton section is dealing with rape and incest and suicide, but all at a slant. It's really wild. And the fact that Faulkner pulled it off and pulled it off the way that he did, it gives a seriousness to the book, a bite to the book. It gives it teeth. And it also is probably my favorite representation of what could be classified as stream of consciousness. So if we think about the way that Joyce has done it, the way that Thomas Bernard has done it, the way that Virginia Woolf has done it, on and on, at least in all of the different representations of stream of consciousness style that I've come across, the Quinton section, which teases language and syntax endlessly, punctuation even, or lack thereof, to tease out these different modes of stream of consciousness, is probably my favorite. I mean, honestly, I can't say enough about this section and its artistry. Yeah. Faulkner has this incredible way of making everyday things rich instruments of symbolism. The complexities of Quinton's relationship with Caddy begin to emerge. Women, and there are these haunting symbols. So if on the father / male / patriarchal side of Quinton, it's the horror of death and time, mortality that's raining down and oppressing Quinton. Then on the matrilineal side, it's women and dirtiness and violence and shame and really impotence all wrapped up together. So Quinton is just a poor guy, and he's set up for, well, what happens? Yeah. Blah, 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 blah. Yep. Okay. So I've already said that. Yeah. All right, so let's dive into it. We're now, June 2nd, 1910. So we've just gone back 1910, what's that, 1928, 18 years. We've just gone back 18 years. And Quinton, as we find out, his father, his parents, sold their field, which then becomes the golf course that is our opening tableau in the entire book, in order to pay the tuition to send Quinton to Harvard. So they're trying to make something out of him. When the shadow of the sash appeared on the curtains, it was between 7 and 8 o'clock, and then I was in time again, hearing the watch. It was grandfather's, and when father gave it to me, he said, I give you the mausoleum of all hope and desire. And then it goes on and on. So with Benji, we've in a sense been almost timeless or outside of time, right? So time is not really even a factor for Benji. Everything's sort of in the present. But now we are thrust in time. I mean, right there in the second line, he says, and then I was in time again. So now we've gone from being outside of time, without bounds, to horribly oppressed by it. The watch / clock / time that encompasses all hope and desire. And if we look back, I've got a link back here to 44. Father said, I see why I did this. So the father is apparently very much a fatalist, pretty glum guy. He says, because no battle is ever won, they are never even fought. The field only reveals to man his own folly and despair, and victory is an illusion of philosophers and fools. So pretty gloomy guy. And this reminded me back on page 44 in the Benji section, the father is quoting Latin, et ego in Arcadia, which means death is also present in paradise. So no escaping death. A little bit later, it says the tug came back downstream, the water shearing in long rolling cylinders, rocking the float at last with the echo of passage. The float lurching onto the rolling cylinder with a plopping sound and a long, jarring noise as the door rolled back and 2 men emerged carrying a shell. And it's also in the Quinton section that you start to see that influence on later writers like Cormac McCarthy, with just some of this beautiful prose, especially to describe the natural world. Later on, we get this. Jason will make a splendid banker. He is the only one of my children with any practical sense. You can thank me for that. He takes after my people. The others are all Compson. So this is Quinton remembering something that his mother is saying. His mother, like I said, sees this dichotomy between the father's people, the Compsons, and she attributes Benji, Quinton, and Caddy to being basically Compson blood. But Jason, she sees as following in her family's line. He's going to be a Boscombe, and he's going to be this great banker, and so on. And there's a connection there between the whole subplot of this man Herbert Head, who is supposed to give Jason a banking job, and so on. We'll get there in a little bit. And this is also he's remembering stuff his parents are saying. We have sold Benji's pasture so that Quinton may go to Harvard, as I said earlier. Yeah, still remembering stuff that his mother has said. She says, that streak of Compson selfishness and false pride. And then Jason can do no wrong because he is more Bascom. I think I've been saying Boscom. I don't know. Bascom, Boscom. Let's toss the whole thing up. Than Compson. So, the parents are drilling in. They've got, all these ideas of bloodlines and inheritance or heredity, predestination, symbols of whether you're blessed or cursed. All these things are being passed down to these poor children. Again, with some great writing here. Think about the heaviness and the heat. And this is not in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is back in Jefferson. It says, even sound seemed to fail in this air, like the air was worn out with carrying sound so long. It's just a wonderful poetic way to describe the stifling heat. And then later it says, I walked upon my shadow, tramping it into the dappled shade of trees again. And two things, like I said, well, three things. First of all, it's just beautiful. Just a beautiful way to move a character, right? To give that sense to the reader of movement and time passing. I walked upon my shadow, tramping it into the dappled shade of trees again. So there's that. Then there's also the symbol of time. The fact that the fact that there can be dappled shade and a shadow to walk upon is because the sun is at a certain point in the sky. But then also, life's but a walking shadow. That Shakespeare Macbeth titular allusion again. Another great piece of writing. I ran down the hill in that vacuum of crickets, like a breath traveling across a mirror. Oh man, that's got that earthy poeticism to it. As we start to move throughout the Quinton section, and his mind starts operating rapidly and remembering all these things, especially his inability to avenge his sister Caddy against Dalton Ames. We'll get a little bit more into that in a moment. Like I said, the syntax and even the punctuation begin to break down and shift. Faulkner, you have to see it, but Faulkner, he gets to where paragraphs aren't rendered conventionally anymore. Stuff is enjammed, just like poetry would be. And in the midst of some of this enjammed fragmentation that's going on in Quinton's mind, again, Faulkner rendering Quinton's consciousness in a vein that captures and conveys Quinton's character to us, just like he does with Benji, and then he'll do again with Jason, is just such an extraordinary feat of writing. Faulkner was just a master. But in the midst of all this, he goes, there's a curse on us. It's not our fault. It is our fault. And it's all on one line. Nothing's capitalized. There's no syntax, no punctuation. Even in there's a curse on us, there's not even an apostrophe for the contraction of theirs. It's just, there it is. And it says, there's a curse on us. It's not our fault. It is our fault. His mind is just going wildly, grappling with whether they're cursed or not, whether they're culpable, whether they can even do anything about the curse. Towards the end of the section, Quinton remembers this sort of showdown at a bridge in Mississippi when he goes and confronts Dalton Ames, who has slept with Caddy, who has taken her virginity. and he wants to avenge Caddy against this guy, and he fails. And there's this moment when it says, "I leaned on the rail and looked at the water." And at this point, especially on a subsequent reading, maybe not on the first reading, but on subsequent readings, it's a powerful, powerful moment that foreshadows his fate at the bridge much later in life, or in the present of this section's designated day, in Cambridge over the Charles River. And it's really powerful. And then in Cambridge, he runs into this immigrant girl, or as some of the locals call her, a foreigner, for a dialectic rendering of foreigner. She's this young Italian girl, and he's the only one who's given her any attention or being nice to her or trying to help her find her parents. But at one point, her brother shows up, gets the wrong idea about what Quinton's about, and beats him up, right? The only thing Quinton's concerned with, even though he's gotten beat up and he's not done anything to defend himself or the little girl, he just keeps saying, "Did I hurt him any? Did I hurt him any?" And so, again, Faulkner draws these lines between his inability to defend or avenge Caddy and his inability to do so with the young Italian girl there in Massachusetts. And it sort of seals his fate. That admittedly he starts the day pretty much resolved. Yeah, and there's another part as it really starts to get in there toward the end, and his consciousness really starts to break up. It says, "The watch telling its furious lie on the dark table." And this is one indication of where a lot of people have drawn a link between Faulkner and Bergson, Henri Bergson, and his idea of fate and time and consciousness. Because Bergson really drew this distinction between mechanized time, clocks, watches, the workday, the calendar, all these ways in which we govern time, usually to capitalist ends. And then, what did he call it? Real time, or I can't remember exactly what Bergson called it, but there's mechanized time, and then there's like realized time, like the time as we experience it, without watches, without clocks, without calendars. And I like that, how, he gets in there and Quinton refers to the watch as telling a furious lie as it's sitting there ticking. Like that isn't real time. Okay. Real time and the real experience of time is what we get when we read The Sound and the Fury. So, for everyone who has criticized Faulkner for making a mess of the timeline, for not just telling a linear story, this is part of the reason why. It's not superfluous. It's not just an artist's whim. It's not difficulty for difficulty's sake. It's for a very specific purpose. Yeah. And he's sitting here, he's remembering, "Harvard is such a fine sound. 40 acres is no high price for a fine sound. A fine dead sound. We will swap Benji's pasture for a fine dead sound." So it's almost like, again, it's like the biblical trading of the birthright for a bowl of lentils. But it also has that ring of that posturing of gentility mixed into it. And then finally, with what, 3-4 pages to go, just when you think Faulkner can't push his formalism any farther, he starts to lowercase I, as in I am. So Benji's I, first person I, starts to get rendered in lowercase and then goes back to uppercase. And there is a great case to be made that this shows sort of the peak of his self or ego or I disintegrating. It's just wonderful. So before we go into the Jason section, just to give some context here, and if you don't want spoilers, hopefully you haven't even made it this far. But from what I take away, Caddy lost her virginity to Dalton Ames. She ended up pregnant. The mother contrived to pin down a husband for her. It happened to be this banker in Indiana, Herbert Head. Everything was set for them to get married and then for him to give Jason a job as a banker. But then when he learned that Caddy was pregnant with someone else's baby, he threw her out and the job for Jason never materialized. However, as we go into this section and start reading through it, we learn that her child, she ends up sort of giving up the child, whom she names Quinton. There's all kinds of question marks around that. It appears from the Quinton section that we just finished. I didn't bring this up, but it appears that Quinton couldn't avenge her, but he also didn't want her to get in trouble. He definitely had like an erotic love for Caddy. And he even tried to tell his father that the baby was his, that he and Caddy had committed incest. But the father just kind of waves him on. But in any case, she decides to name her child after her brother. And so the child's name is Quinton and is being raised by Jason and Dilsey, chiefly, but lives in the house. And at this point, we learn that Caddy is not welcome anywhere near the family, though she makes appearances. And there are all kinds of little schemes and stuff going on. All right, as we enter the Jason section, there's a real contrast here between Quinton and Jason in terms of racism and xenophobia. Quinton was very kind to that immigrant, that foreigner, the little Italian girl that everyone else was spurning. Whereas we'll see that Jason is just sort of this ruthless, soulless liar, this conniving liar who only cares about himself and getting rich, making it big, while at the same time, his actions and circumstances are showing that that's far from the truth. He's just a clerk at a hardware store there. And he's very just condescending, racist. He would never treat the young girl in Cambridge the way that Quinton had treated her. And this contrast between the brothers is really striking too, now that I've read the Faulkner biography, because I learned that Faulkner had a brother who was a staunch segregationist and was mortified when Faulkner made any inkling that there should be integration. So it's a little sharper reading this, knowing that. Anyway, let's go into the Jason section. Okay, blah blah blah. I don't care, she says. I'm bad and I'm going to hell, and I don't care. I'd rather be in hell than anywhere where you are. So, who was that? Who is this Caddy? School. You wish you were dead. This might be Quinton. Everybody in this town knows what you are. I'm gonna slip around. I'm not going to have anywhere with my family going on. Yeah, okay. I think this is Quinton. Goodness. I guess I just expected myself to remember by the time I made this video. I'm so sorry. She says she knows she's bad. Like Quinton has this yeah, it's her. She has this defiance. I'm bad and I'm going to hell and I don't care. I'd rather be in hell than anywhere where you are. Which is also interesting too, to consider purgatory versus hell. But anyway, how long would a man that thought the first of the month came on the 6th last in business? So another thing we find is that whereas Benji was outside of time, Quinton was aware of time and aware of being within its strictures, but ultimately rejected it as a lie. You know, the clock furiously telling the watch furiously telling its lie on the table. Jason is governed by mechanical time. And in his section, time is very precise, such as on the very next page, it says it was a couple of minutes to 10. So we go from no time to then a watch, and kind of knowing what time of day it is by, you know, the sun acting as a sundial on Quinton's shadow, to then knowing it was a couple of minutes to 10. And there's a scene of putting flowers on Quinton's grave. And so this is our confirmation that Quinton is, in fact, dead, did, in fact, commit suicide. As most people know, he committed suicide. He purchases a pair of irons to weigh himself down when he jumps into the Charles. And there I was, without any hat, looking like I was crazy too. Like a man would naturally think one of them is crazy and another one drowned himself and the other one was turned out into the street by her husband. So right there, and it's sandwiched in there, and it's from Jason's inside his mind, but we get confirmed everything about his brothers and sisters, his brothers and sister. One of them is crazy, Benji, nay Mari. One drowned himself, Quinton, and the other one was turned out into the street by her husband. That would be Caddy, turned out into the street by Herbert Head. And it might take a while. I wrote this note because it might take a while to catch on in this section. At least for me, it did. The first 2 times, at least, that when he says, if he thinks he can run into the woods with my niece, I remember that tripping me up. And then that's when it hit me that Caddy named her daughter after her brother. And you get that confirmed a little later on. But when you first encounter these things, you know, you have to read carefully. And here's the crazy thing is people are talking about this and says, sure it is. I says, she's too much like both of them to doubt that. And that's when you sit there and wonder, is Quinton the product of incest? And I will say that, you know, I'm still undecided, but I lean towards no, because I don't think the timeline lines up with it. But it sure is interesting that he says, he's referring to Quinton, the young girl, and he says, too much like both of them. And it does appear like he's saying she's too much like Quinton and Caddy. Quinton and Caddy, brother and sister, to doubt that. And then she says, I couldn't bear that, she says. I think this is Caroline, the mother, talking. And then Jason says, then quit thinking about it. Has she been worrying you anymore about getting out at night? But then again, there's an ambiguity where it could just be, they see Quinton and Caddy as being defiant. And that, not necessarily offspring, but just the same genetics, which would be for Caroline and Jason, the Compson blood versus the Boscombe blood. All right, then we go into the third section here. And this is the section that chronologically takes place the latest and concerns mainly Dilsey going to church. Listen to this. I love some of this writing. On the wall above a cupboard, invisible save at night, by lamplight, and even then, evincing an enigmatic profundity, because it had but one hand. A cabinet clock ticked, then with the preliminary sound as if it had cleared its own throat, struck 5 times. And I was remembering back to an old grandfather clock in my grandparents' house growing up, and I remembered that I could hear that preliminary sound as if the clock had cleared its throat before then striking. And I was just like, bravo, Faulkner. So then later on, Dilsey says, you got just as much Compson devilment in you as any of them. And she's talking about another one of the servants. I believe she's talking to Luster, right? Or is it TP? Is it her son? See what I mean? You can't get it all on even read after read. But in any case, it's definitely it's one of the black children within the servant side of the Compson house. So it's clearly, for the reader, it's clearly not a blood relation. Well, I mean, I guess it could be, but it's clearly not the blood relation. But the important thing is that what Dilsey is saying is that kid who isn't Compson by blood has just as much of their devilment. And so that is again Dilsey cutting through all the shenanigans about it being this blood curse or spiritual curse. And it's almost like, hey, by proximity, this is learned behavior. Oh, this is a striking moment. On the floor lay a soiled undergarment of cheap silk, a little too pink. From a half-open bureau drawer dangled a single sock. The window was open. A pear tree grew there, close against the house. So Jason has just thrown open the door. They've seen that the young Quinton girl, Caddy's illegitimate child, has escaped out of the window again. But this recalls her own mother, Caddy, as a girl with her dirty underwear, climbing the tree and looking through the window. It's this crazy moment of connection that's just so Shakespearean, so poetic, almost cinematic. And Mrs. Compson says, I knew the minute they named her Quinton, this would happen. I think that's the time when it's really drilled home, like for sure. There's no question of her naming and what the rest of the family thinks about it. And here we go. As the scudding day passed overhead, the dingy windows glowed and faded in ghostly retrograde. A car passed along the road outside, laboring in the sand, died away. Dilsey sat bolt upright, her hand on Ben's knee. 2 tears slid down her fallen cheeks, in and out of the myriad coruscations of immolation and abnegation and time. And it's a powerful, powerful image of these tears going down Dilsey's face, thinking about all the toil she's gone through with this family and with these children. To where, we have a very good sense of what she's feeling in this moment, but just also rendered in such beautiful prose. And then later with this repetition of the idea of scudding. The bells were ringing again, high in the scudding sunlight in bright, disorderly tatters of sound. So you've got that synesthesia. And it says, Ben sat, holding the flower in his fist, his gaze empty and untroubled. And this is right near the very end, and to me recalls the mouse at the end of Mice and Men with, I think, was it Lenny or George? I feel like George was the giant, right? Same kind of concept here. This innocent giant who just wants to hold something beautiful in his hand. So, yeah, that's my commentary on the amazing The Sound and the Fury. Faulkner is quoted. I'll end with this. Faulkner is quoted with saying that he wanted to create a beautiful and tragic little girl because he never had a sister and he lost his daughter in infancy. And so, like Faulkner, never getting to know a sister, never getting to know a daughter, the book never really lets us know Caddy, which for me is part of what makes this a brilliant, wonderful, perennial, lasting tragedy.